Hello everybody, and welcome to the next of our topics. This time we're going to get into the actual American Revolution. So we've discussed some of the factors leading up to the Revolution, things like the French and Indian War, the debt that England incurs as a result of the war, some of the taxes that they issue in order to try to pay down that debt, and then some of the American reactions to those actions by the British government. And so ultimately, things reach the point by 1775 that the two sides have basically become completely incompatible. And so what happens from there? Well, the American Revolution is a somewhat kind of misunderstood event. It's like the Civil War in that respect in a lot of ways, because people have an idea of what the revolution was based more off of patriotism and historical memory than it is based off of the realities of the war and what was going on and why. So first things first, we need to consider some of the sort of advantages and disadvantages that the two sides have. And they do both have advantages and disadvantages. Here again, the popular narrative is very much, go America for being able to defeat the most powerful country on the planet, and these kinds of things. And there is something to some of that, but it's not just that. So Britain's drawbacks or their disadvantages. They are 3,000 plus miles away from England, surrounded by largely a hostile population. But it is certainly not the case that everybody in the colonies was a patriot. It is certainly not the case that everyone in the colonies wanted independence. And it's certainly not the case that everybody in the colonies even thought that Britain was in some way being unfair or oppressive to the colonists. But there is, even with all of that, there is certainly a large number of Americans who are hostile to the British presence. And so this is going to make it difficult for the British Army to operate. And the fact that you're 3,000 miles away means that it's difficult to communicate. It takes literally months for a message to go one way across the Atlantic Ocean, let alone if you have to go back and forth to receive an answer to your message. You also have the difficulty of resupplying or remanning your troop populations, your troop numbers. So 3,000 miles is certainly a significant kind of a distance to try to manage in 18th century warfare. The British Army is operating across a very large area. The war ends up existing north to south, east to west, pretty much in the entirety of the American colonies. So during different parts of the war, during different time periods of the war's duration, it's centered more noticeably in certain sections, whether it's New England or the Mid-Atlantic states, colonies, or the southern colonies, but it does happen everywhere in one way or another. And in some cases, it's fairly difficult terrain for the British to manage. There's also no single nerve center or sort of focal point that if the British would capture that one thing, it would end the war. So if you think of something like World War II, right? Especially the European theater of World War II, Berlin is the center of the Nazi German regime. When Berlin falls, it's just a matter of days after that when Germany surrenders. So Germany is fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting, all the way up till May of 1945. Berlin collapses and is taken by the Soviet Union, and within the week, Germany surrenders officially. To put that in sort of comparison, in the American Revolution, the British occupy Boston at the beginning. They get driven out of Boston, but they occupy New York for almost the entire war. They occupy Philadelphia, which was technically the capital of the colonies. They occupy Philadelphia for about 18 months. And they occupy places like Charleston or Williamsburg, Virginia, or a number of other colonial capitals at different times during the war as well. But that never is the thing that causes the Americans to stop fighting. And so that's going to be another factor or aspect of the war that is going to work against the British efforts. Their advantages are pretty significant, though. They have a large, very professional army. They, if they push the panic button, can hire mercenaries, some of the best mercenaries in Europe, in fact. Even with all of the debt that they have as a result of the French and Indian War, Britain still has massive financial resources that they can tap into, whether it is credit from other European powers, whether it's credit from English banks, whether it's the ability to tax their population in order to raise more money. So they have money at their disposal if they need it. And in addition to the population of Americans that are patriots, there is a fairly sizable minority who are loyalists or Tories, right? These are people who support the British cause, whether it is sort of nominally by writing editorials into newspapers or that sort of thing, or whether it goes so far as to actually joining portions of the British Army and British Navy. There are Americans who really believe that the cause of independence is the wrong one. And so this is going to be sort of some historians call it America's first civil war. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but it is significant in the fact that not all Americans are unanimously sort of lined up behind the cause of independence. So Britain's pros and cons. What do we see then for the American side? In some cases, the American pros and cons are the flip of what we see for the British. The Americans, for the majority of the war, and throughout the majority of the theaters of the war, have fairly poorly trained officers. Officers in the 18th century tend more to be gentlemen than they have military experience. So there's a handful of Americans that have some kind of experience in the military, but by and large, they get their role, they get their position because of who they are more than what they know. The government of the Americans, it's not terribly effective, right? The Second Continental Congress is often at each other's throats over petty political squabbles. There is a very powerful states/colonies rights perspective that for a lot of people trumps the idea of national unity. The government has virtually no power to raise money because they have to ask the states to provide money, and if the states choose not to do that, there's not a whole lot that the Continental Congress can do. They're also fighting for a difficult kind of a goal, right? Here again, if you compare it to other kinds of wars, what you're trying to do from the American perspective is convince the British to give you independence. And that's not a particularly objective kind of achievement, right? It's not like you can point to one thing that as soon as you do that one thing, then the British will decide to give you your independence. And so it's going to be kind of a moving target in some respects. The issue of loyalists is going to be a negative for the American cause, right? Whereas an advantage for the British to have loyalists scattered throughout the population, it's a negative for the Americans because these are people who can pass along information. These are people who can disrupt the interior of the American lines. These are people who can do different things to try to cause problems for the Patriot cause. Advantages, though, you have a population that is familiar with their surroundings. It's familiar with the landscape where the war is going to be fought. And because of the nature of life in colonial America, this is a population that has some of the skills necessary to be a soldier already at hand, right? So these are people who are oftentimes fairly good shots because they have to hunt for their food. In some cases, as unpleasant as it is to think about, they can be fairly good shots because they're responsible for protecting their town from Native American attacks. Well, this isn't going to mean that they are disciplined. It doesn't mean that they're going to know military tactics or strategy. But once they get onto the battlefield, they're going to have at least one or two of the really essential kinds of skills that are necessary to lead to success. And as much as it pains me to admit, because I am not a fan of France in whatsoever capacity, but the reality is that the Americans would never have been successful in the revolution had it not been for assistance from the French. This is financial assistance, this is material assistance, this is military support, this is logistical support, diplomatic support, you name it, right? The French throw a lot of weight behind the American cause. Important to keep in mind, this is not because France agrees with the American idea of independence. Far from it. They see this as an opportunity to weaken the British and to get a certain amount of payback for the French defeat in the 7 Years' War just about 10 years earlier. And so this is not a completely altruistic cause of humanity kind of thing. This is a calculating diplomatic and strategic consideration on the part of the French. So tensions have been kind of ebbing and flowing between the British and the colonists for more than a decade before the first actual shots fired in anger that will be the American Revolution. And those are going to happen early in the morning of April 19th, 1775. British regulars have been given the order to march out of Boston, where they have been kind of bivouacked, and they're marching to a town about 15, not quite 20 miles away, called Concord, Massachusetts. They have received word that the colonials have been stockpiling arms and ammunition and supplies at an armory in Concord, and the other sort of secondary mission or goal of this operation is to try to capture two of the prominent New England revolutionary figures, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who are supposed to be lodging somewhere nearby. So this effort begins late in the night of April 18th. Before dawn, shortly before dawn, the morning of April 19th, they have arrived at Lexington, Massachusetts. Well, along the way, as they are marching out of Boston, there are different riders who have left Boston and towns in the Boston area to try to pass along the warning of the British advance. Paul Revere is certainly the most famous of these people, but he is definitely not the only one, and Revere doesn't even actually finish his ride. He gets stopped by British sentries at one point and never manages to make it through the entire route. Two other men, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, in many ways actually reach more Massachusetts residents with the warning of the British march than Revere did. But be that as it may, the advance notice allows for the American militia, known as the Minutemen in New England at the time, to gather and prepare for the British arrival. So the British arrive at this sort of field near the edge of Lexington, the town of Lexington. Shots are fired back and forth. There are a handful of casualties on both sides. From there, the British march on to Concord. They get to the armory and find that it has, for the most part, been emptied. There's another skirmish, both at the armory and at a bridge crossing a stream in town. And here it's a little bit larger kind of exchange of gunfire. More people are involved, more people are injured on both sides. And ultimately, the British then have to retreat, or at least return to Boston. And they do so now, after enough notice and enough warning and enough time to prepare. The British are retreating back to Boston while constantly being harassed by American militia and just by average everyday residents of Massachusetts who take an opportunity to kind of take pot shots at the British as they're walking along the road back to Boston. So in the end, the British returned to Boston having suffered not quite 300 casualties. Again, keep in mind, casualties means wounded as well as killed. So these numbers don't necessarily mean almost 300 British soldiers killed as a result. It's a far fewer number of people who are killed as a result of these than there are people who are injured. And not quite 100 American casualties. So this is the first shots of the revolution, right? This is when the revolution kicks off from a military standpoint, from an actual conflict standpoint. Certainly the tensions that could be kind of wrapped up in the rebellion, and if you want to call that part of the revolution, you can take those things back a little bit further than 1775. But the first shots of the revolution happen in 75, and then the war will last officially until 1783, which actually puts it as one of the longer wars that the United States is involved in its history. So, Lexington and Concord, the first shots of the revolution, the first battle of the revolution happens a couple months later in June of 1775. And this is a result of the British occupation of Boston. So Britain has a fairly large number of soldiers in Boston proper, and the Americans want to dislodge those soldiers, right? They want to drive those soldiers out. So what they do is they begin to establish a fortified position on a hill overlooking the town of Boston, and that hill is Breed's Hill. The battle will ultimately be more famously known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is a smaller little kind of hill near to Breed's Hill. Not all that much actually happens on Bunker Hill. So to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure why Bunker Hill becomes the sort of moniker that the battle goes by, but that's kind of the way it works. So the Americans are occupying this hill, and they're hoping that they'll be able to bring some artillery, some cannons and mortars, up to this hill so that they can basically just lob artillery fire down onto the city of Boston and hit the British while they can't really return fire. And this is obviously not going to be acceptable for the British. It doesn't make any sense for the British to sit there and wait for the Americans to get this artillery in position on these hills. And so the British decide to attack before the Americans have the opportunity to get those cannons up there. So they attack June 17th, 1775, and the British are convinced that this is going to be basically a walk in the park, that the American militia is untrained and undisciplined and basically inept at 18th century warfare. And they partially underestimate the Americans, but it's also partially the fact that being in a fortified position on a hill gives the Americans a lot of advantages, because the British have to move up the hill trying to attack, and that's never an ideal situation. Ultimately, the British win, but it is a hugely costly victory. 1,000 British soldiers are killed or injured as a result of the Battle of Breed's Hill. This is 40% of their total force. And that's against about 400 American casualties. So it is definitely a British victory. The Americans are driven off of the hill. The British end the day in possession of that piece of ground. But it's not necessarily the way that anybody would want a military campaign to go. And it does give the Americans a certain amount of sort of a morale boost, right? Because this is convincing the Americans, hey, you know, in the first time when we actually faced down the British regular army in a planned, organized, controlled kind of a way, we had to retreat, but we inflicted quite a bit of damage. This is not going to be the norm of the American Revolution. The Americans lose noticeably more battles than they win. It's just, fortunately, the Americans win the right battles at the right times, and that's going to really make all the difference. But the Americans do not win the Revolutionary War because they beat up on the British and the British end up having to surrender or else fate, you know, abject humiliation. The Americans really squeeze out a victory against pretty much all odds in a lot of ways. So the Battle of Bunker Hill kicks off the revolution in terms of, you know, the two sides beginning to make deliberate strategic and tactical decisions in the recognition that this is now a war, right? This isn't just a series of rebellious actions in one place or another. This has expanded to the point where it's an outright war. But this is still more than a year before the Americans start to even consider declaring independence. And so that's going to be a process that takes a little while. And it's going to be a process that is overseen largely by the Second Continental Congress. And this is going to be the political body that will run the colonial effort during the revolution. As I mentioned, it is made up of people who oftentimes see their role more as defending their state's interest as opposed to defending the interest of the entire colonial effort as a whole. So there's lots of infighting, there's lots of disagreement, there's lots of obstructionism, there's lots of political maneuvering and positioning that goes on. There are certainly some bright lights who serve in the Continental Congress, but it is very much a fairly problematic kind of situation in a lot of ways. One of the early decisions that they're faced with is the creation of a continental army. And this, believe it or not, is actually a point of debate for a lot of people. The question being, is it dangerous for the colonies to have an army at the sort of command of a particular individual? Because lots of Americans perceived that as a tool of tyranny, right? A tool of despotism, that somebody could take control of the army and then use it to establish power over America. So it was a very prickly kind of conversation, not just in terms of who to put in charge of the army, but whether there should be an army at all. And ultimately, the decision is George Washington should be the person put in charge of the army. There are times throughout the American Revolution when there are potentially serious challenges to Washington's command, serious questions about Washington's capabilities and qualifications, and even his capacity to run the army. But why was Washington chosen in the first place? Well, he's chosen partially because he did serve in the 7 Years' War, not exactly with distinction. He never really won any of the battles or skirmishes that he was involved in, but he did serve, so he has military experience, and more importantly, he has experience within the British Army. So he has some knowledge of some of the leaders of the British Army, he has some knowledge of some of their tactics. He's also from the South, and this is going to be really, really important for a couple of reasons. For one, there's a lot of perception that the Revolution, especially in the early stages, was more of a New England kind of a thing, right? Lots of what's going on is happening in and around Boston. There are some incidents that are happening along the coast of Rhode Island or the coast of Connecticut. Some stuff going on in places like Philadelphia and New York. But the southern colonies at the start of the Revolution really feel kind of removed. And so it's very important to sort of draw them into the situation a little bit, right? And if you can say, hey, southern colonies, look at one of the most prominent people in the South, George Washington. He believes that this is a cause that affects everybody and not just the North, not just New England. So maybe you should get on board too. One of the other things about Virginia in particular is it is probably the richest of the colonies or the states. And so you really need to guarantee that Virginia will get on board in particular because it has money that it can put to the cause. Washington is not a brilliant general. I am a huge George Washington fan, but it has to be admitted that as a military leader, he's average at best. He is almost never going to outthink his opponent on the battlefield. He is going to outstubborn his opponent sometimes. He's going to outluck his opponent. He's going to guess well from time to time. Yeah, there are times when he will think better and think his way through a victory. But he doesn't win a lot of battles, and the ones that he does win, oftentimes it's a result of some other factors. But his great advantages are in his personality. He is absolutely convinced of and devoted to the American cause. He is astonishingly charismatic, dynamic, magnetic. He's a person that when he steps into a room, I mean, he's a large person to begin with. He's probably about 6'4", maybe 250, 265. So he is a big person. So he fills a room physically, but his personality also fills a room. He is beloved by his soldiers. He still behaves as an 18th century gentleman would. He behaves as an aristocrat in a lot of ways. So he's very aloof and very removed. But his soldiers never doubt his dedication to the cause and his dedication to them. Whether it's in terms of securing supplies, whether it's in terms of guaranteeing their pay, any number of different things. He leads from the front. There are a number of times when he is right out at the leading edge of a particular battle. And there are times when he'll come back to camp afterwards and, you know, his jacket and hat will be riddled with bullet holes. So he wins the respect and the admiration and the loyalty of his men. And so these are going to be incredibly important factors in ultimately the success of the revolution, not because Washington is necessarily winning battles with his mind or with his tactics, not necessarily because the American army is superior to the British army, although by the end of the war it really does start to become a fairly professional, fairly effective fighting machine. But Washington presents a number of really great advantages that the British simply cannot match in most cases. So we've established sort of the beginning of the war. When we come back, we're going to talk about the meat of the war, so the sort of late 1770s, and then some of the changing tactics and strategies that will lead to the end of the war ultimately, in terms of major fighting, the end of the war in October of 1781. So I hope everybody is staying current with the full PowerPoints on Blackboard. Let me know if you've got questions about any of that, and I will certainly help out. I hope you're all doing really well, and I will see everybody back here soon when we sort of plow a little bit deeper into the war itself.